All right, I think we can go ahead and get started this afternoon. Welcome to everyone. To some of you, it is still morning. To those of you on the West Coast and to those of you in Europe, it is evening. So wherever you are in the world, welcome. We are so happy that you are able to join us for workshop number 2 of 3 in the Digging Up Data series. This workshop series is co-sponsored by Open Context as well as ASOR, and we'll be telling you a little bit more about these organizations in the context of the lecture. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, this is workshop 2 of 3 in a series, and the topic of this workshop is working with archaeological data. So we'll be talking about how to find, produce, curate, and analyze data today. In the next workshop, my personal favorite, we'll be talking about telling stories with archaeological data. We're going to be talking about how to add a better, more narrative approach to your data to interest not only a general public audience in the context of public archaeology, but also your peers. We're going to be talking about how to tell better stories with data, in other words. Next slide, please. In terms of a few housekeeping activities, there are a few things that we can all do to help the workshop run smoothly. The first thing that I'd like to let you know is that we will be recording and sharing this workshop. We would also like to ask everyone, unless you are speaking, to keep yourself muted throughout. Please also use the chat box for questions and any relevant comments. You are more than welcome to have a conversation or meta conversation going in the chat. We welcome you to do this. And last but not least, we would like to let everyone know that this meeting will be governed by the ASOR Code of Conduct. Please see this for expectations for this meeting. I would like to also acknowledge that the land that UCF campuses stand upon today is the traditional homeland of a variety of peoples, which include the Timucua and the Seminole people. I'll begin with a brief introduction of myself. My name is Dr. Tiffany Earley-Spadoni. In the most general terms, I am a geospatial expert and field archaeologist, as well as historian who studies northern Mesopotamia. In terms of my relationship to this event, I am the chair of the Early Career Scholars of ASOR. I am the chair of the ASOR Digital Archaeology and History Standing Session, and I am also an assistant professor in digital history at the University of Central Florida, which is located in Orlando, Florida. Next slide, please.
So my turn now. My name is Leigh Ann Lieberman. Thank you all for coming today. Before I introduce myself, I just want to acknowledge that I reside on the unceded indigenous land of the Tongva peoples out in Claremont, California, and I recognize that I have and continue to benefit from the use and occupation of this land. I honor not only the history of this land, but also the Tongva people that are thriving members of our community today. So a little bit about me to kind of echo Tiffany's introduction. So I'm representing today an organization called the Alexandria Archive Institute, or Open Context, as their Director of Strategic Partnerships. I also have an appointment at Pomona College. I teach art history. I'm going to be running to my class right after this workshop is done. And I have roles in several archaeological projects and I work in Italy, Sardinia, and Sicily, so pretty extensively, but in that very concentrated area in the Mediterranean. I'm an archaeologist who's interested in material culture and especially interested in questions of reuse and recycling during the Roman period. So oftentimes the focus of my work comes out from that methodological lens. But I also want to take a brief opportunity to introduce some people that won't be presenting with Tiffany and I today. Our work at Open Context really centers around the dissemination and preservation side of data, but our discussion today that we're going to be leading is really going to give us an opportunity at Open Context to think about the planning and the initial phases of a data-driven project with you all who are participating in this workshop today. So what kinds of data sets will enable you to accomplish robust analyses? What kinds of data sets are ready for publishing and reuse? We think about kind of the publishing side of things in our organization, but there are a lot of steps that go into that process that we're excited to walk through with you today. So we think that any data-driven project can be broken down into three main components prior to sharing and publishing your results and your data. So that's how we've kind of organized this workshop today. If you're interested, you can follow along on the slides. The link there is at the bottom. First, we're going to talk about preparing for data, where we'll focus on asking good questions that can help you really define your data universe. We'll also focus on finding appropriate models for how to organize your data. And some of this is going to pivot off what we were talking about in the workshop last month. So some of it might sound a little familiar if you were able to attend or watch that recording. Next, we'll talk about curating data, where we'll focus on how to organize and clean your data. And finally, we'll think about analyzing data, where we'll discuss how you can figure out what tools you'll need to learn and what skills you'll need to master in order to answer your research questions. In our next workshop in November, we're going to turn our attention, as Tiffany was saying before, to sharing our results with diverse public audiences. But before that, we'll conclude this workshop just by sort of summarizing some takeaways and some next steps. And actually, we're going to do this throughout, so we won't spend too much time on that at the end. So pay attention for actions that you can take right now through all of these different steps. I also really want to stress before we jump into it that the good practices that we're going to describe today are not all or nothing options. So no matter where you are in your current research program, taking little steps towards better data practices can go a really long way. So remember that it's never too late or too early to start adopting some of the methods that we're going to be discussing. So in our workshop last month, we defined data literacy as the ability to engage constructively through and with data. And we also discussed why it's important for archaeologists to be data literate, and we outlined some of the incremental steps we could take towards becoming data literate scholars. But before we even get into data literacy, we might actually want to take an important step backwards to allow ourselves to reflect on our research practices more generally. So with that in mind, one of our goals for today is going to be to think about how we prepare for data that meets our research objectives. In that same workshop, we talked a bit about data collection methods, highlighting some of the differences between field research and library research and how those differences might guide the way you think about data and the way you document the information that you've collected. We won't rehash that discussion today, but I do want to stress that the way we approach our research is important because in many ways it dictates how we're going to approach our research data. At the risk of grossly oversimplifying a broad spectrum of methods, I want to encourage us to think about two main approaches to research. There are those of us who walk around carrying a research question in our pockets, and then, in that walk, we'll look for data sets that fit our research questions and fit our agenda. There are also those of us that find data and use those data to help us figure out what questions to ask. So again, a gross oversimplification, but if you'll bear with me in this, I think that this could summarize the way a lot of us probably approach our research and our work. So I want to toss this question out to you all. So we'll send up a poll in just a second, but how do you begin a research project? Are you a questions first person or are you a data first person? You'll notice that I threw up some more options on there for answers than just data or questions first. All right, we hit just about critical mass with that, so I'll end the poll and share the results. So it's no surprise that a lot of you fall somewhere squarely in the middle with a combination of data and questions from the start of a research project. Both approaches, or a combination of these approaches, can, I think, produce really fruitful results if all the right puzzle pieces are in place. So Tiffany and I just want to kind of describe our methods. Tiffany, do you want to start?
Yes. Okay. So I will begin by contextualizing my advocacy for data first. Typically, when I am advocating for this approach, I am talking to masters or PhD students who are attempting to define a research project. And what I often do to reduce time to completion is I encourage them to use existing data sets to frame their project. And so the method that I describe to them is a little bit like the historical method, in which a historian creates a corpus of data and then determines what sorts of research questions can be asked of this data set. One advantage to this approach is that it can reduce the time to completion of your project, because you're starting with the kinds of questions that your data can definitely tell you, rather than walking around with questions for which data may or may not exist in the wide data universe. So it's an approach that's meant to help with efficiency, as well as staying really close to your data set and the kinds of questions that you're asking. Thank you.
Yeah, and I don't know how much I would advocate for the opposite direction, but I've definitely engaged in a questions first approach in my work. So for my dissertation, I had a really big question about the refoundation of ancient settlements and how these ancient settlements, how the communities that came to occupy these ancient settlements really interacted with and engaged with the material culture of the past. So a big question. And on the one hand, with that question, I had way too much data to draw on for my dissertation. So I had to be sure to limit myself to a specific chronological period, and then to a specific region, and then to specific sites within that region. And even with all those limitations, the data that I organized never quite fit the questions that I wanted to ask for that specific project. And it just made it a lot of headaches in the go of it. To be fair, this did set me up for a follow-up project, but it was really hard going at the time. So I think to piggyback off of what you were saying, Tiffany, I think the idea that there's a question of efficiency involved in how you're choosing how you want to approach a research project. But all that said, regardless, research is an inherently recursive process. So if you're a data first scholar, you'll probably seek data around a particular topic that you're interested in. And that might be where some of you fell on the combination side. Those data are going to help you define your initial questions. And then those questions are going to help you think differently about the data you've gathered. On the flip side, if you're a questions first scholar, your questions are going to encourage you to look for data that may help you answer those questions. And the data you dig up, or what you find, or actually more importantly, what you don't find, is going to encourage you to adjust your initial questions, at which point you're likely going to dive back in to gather more appropriate data. So you can see this cycle that doesn't just sort of go around the circle once, but you could see this being iterative and something that you engage in again and again throughout the course of a project. In either scenario, data first or questions first, defining the parameters or the limits of your data universe, as Tiffany was saying, is an important step in that process. Some of this also necessarily depends on what you have access to. So for your project, Do you spend your time in archives transcribing for the first time the narrative records that were documented by excavators who are working at a particular site? Or are you reorganizing data, maybe from multiple sites that's already been published and interpreted by scholars? Are you creating the data from your own observations and field work that might be less common for people working on master's theses or dissertations, but you never know? And again, is your work a combination of these processes, or is your method not really reflected here at all? So we've got another poll that we're going to send out. All right, we've hit critical mass there, so I'll go ahead and end it, share the results. So actually a lot of variation here, and I want to encourage you to, in the chat, share a 1 or 2 sentence blurb about what you're working on in your project, especially if you're in the combination boat, because I think that that could be really fun to hear people speak more about. And who knows, maybe you'll find someone that you want to sort of talk to more, like we'll hint at in just a second. Ultimately, whatever resources you have access to, you'll want to imagine a research program or a set of related projects that can maintain your attention and interest over a long period of time. For many of you, research is going to be the focus of your careers. And for this reason, it's important to define the scope of what we've been calling your data universe from the very beginning so that you can continue to build what I'm calling a multi-scalar research program over time. So in terms of a data first approach, what may start off as a single, rather simple spreadsheet in which you've recorded data about pottery from a single site could serve as the foundation for what will become a complex relational database that contains information about pottery, other artifact types, and the stratigraphic sequence across multiple sites in a region. In terms of a questions first approach, what starts off as a single question about the types of pottery identified at that single site and what they illustrate about the habits of the people who live there could lead to multiple questions about the relationship between locally produced forms and foreign imports, about foodways and identity, about production and the sourcing of materials across multiple sites in a region. So again, whether you're questions first or data first or some combination of the two, there's a place for you in this sort of path that we're thinking of. Thinking of your research as multi-scalar like this helps you realize that you don't need to ask all the questions at once. Rather, you can develop capacity, especially at the beginning, but also throughout your research process for a larger study that can ultimately sustain and bring focus to your career. And you can keep a running list, or in my case, a pretty busted notebook that contains all of your ideas and all of your directions that you want to pursue in the future. A little big picture planning and imagination can really go a long way. And this is the sort of, feedback that I wished I had gotten earlier in my career, right? To bite off chunks that you could definitely chew, and then to save and sit on the ideas that you're stewing about for later projects and later pursuits. Thinking about your research in this way can also help you recognize two individuals or groups of individuals that will be interested in your work. And I don't just mean the data and the interpretations that you're going to be sharing, but I also mean the methods themselves. The first of these is you. So if you think of your work as a research program rather than as a single standalone project, you'll obviously want to create data sets that are going to be interoperable with one another over time, right? Think of yourself as a collaborator with yourself. If you don't want to start from scratch at the beginning of each related project, how you produce data from the beginning is going to matter. In other words, you want to make sure that the work you do now is ready to be used and can interoperate with the work you do later. So in this sense, in your research program, you and future you are members of the same collaborative team. So of course you want to make sure that you set your teammate up for success. The second of these is other scholars. And here's where we can tap into our conversation last month about the benefits of participating in an open data network and the important outcomes that are achieved when we adopt linked open data standards. By sharing good quality interoperable data, we participate in a research network that we're probably already familiar with in terms of scholarship, but maybe a little less so in terms of data. But how do you know how other scholars are going to want to use the data that you share? And for that matter, how do you know how future you is going to want to use the data you're collecting? There are two great practices that I think can help you figure out how to answer these questions. The first is to set up informational interviews, and maybe the chat today can help you figure out who you might want to reach out to first. There's nothing that people like more than talking about themselves. And for scholars, that often means talking about their research and their career paths. So reach out to people who have undertaken similar research projects. Ask them what they wish they knew when they started. Ask them what advice they'd give to someone who is just starting or to someone at a different phase in their research project. Talk to colleagues in your department, on your field projects, in the ASOR Early Career Scholars group on Facebook. You may even want to reach out to scholars that you haven't had an opportunity to meet yet, but whose names keep popping up in the articles you're reading and the data sets you're reusing. Zoom makes anything possible. So ask around and set up some informational interviews just to get a feel for the landscape. The second practice is to comb through data repositories, data publishing websites, and linked open data resources so that you can begin to identify good quality data, published data sets that you can use as models for your own work. Publishing data is in many ways our end goal, and we're not there yet. But by paying attention to the formats and the methods used by data sets that have been published, and in some cases peer-reviewed, well before the conclusion of your own research project, you can set yourself up not only to get to that goal, but also to prioritize this concept of interoperability from the start. For many types of data and analysis, there are standards that have been established by scholars working in that area of research. These are great models to adopt. For other types of data and analysis, however, the standards may be less firmly established, but there will still always be examples of good practices, good models that you can adopt or adapt to fit the needs of your own research program. This goes back again, in part, to our discussion last month about linked data. Remember that linked data principles encourage you to think about how your data set relates to a wider world of data, both in a very technical sense and in a broader methodological sense. It's this broader methodological sense that helps remind us that we don't do scholarship, we do not research in a vacuum. And again, we're used to thinking about that more, I think, with respect to the big picture than we are with the nitty gritty, than we are with the data themselves. So when you're combing through these repositories, what should you look for? I've got two slides that I just want to walk through really quickly with some data repositories, data publishers, and linked open data vocabulary networks that you might want to begin to familiarize yourselves with. But this is by no means an exhaustive list, and this might the list would vary greatly depending on your own interests. So as a representative from Open Context today, we have certain strengths, especially with respect to ZOARC data. We're also very strong with representation from the Near East and the Mediterranean. So that might be right up a lot of your alleys. But nevertheless, organizations like the Archaeology Data Service, that caters to data from the United Kingdom, and TDAR which caters to data from the United States, you can still find good models in those, right? And you might not necessarily need the contents of the data for your research, but the model is something that you can still adapt and then cite as something that you've used to inform the work that you're doing. Additionally, here we have a number of other projects that you might want to familiarize yourselves with, especially the organizations that provide stable digital representations to concepts according to linked open data principles. Because as we've hinted already today, as we'll talk about some more, and we talked about in the last workshop, being able to create data sets that participate in this wider network of open data is really important, and it's not difficult to do with a little bit of forethought. So thinking about how each of these might intersect in some way with your work could go a long way towards creating data sets that you're ready to share, that you're ready to publish. So to kind of summarize the things we've been talking about with respect to preparing for data, your research questions are necessarily going to be recursive, and your relationship with data is necessarily going to be recursive. Your research program is going to be multi-scalar, something that has many phases that you can continue to pursue over time. And your research data should participate in a broad scholarly network. Those are kind of the big picture takeaways from the last 20 minutes or so. But while you sit and stew on those, I want to just open up the floor for questions, give you guys an opportunity to ask what might be on your mind. And if you type the questions in the chat, we will be sure to get them, even if we can't necessarily address them all today. Tiffany and Sarah, I don't know if you saw any questions, but I do see a lot of people talking about their data and the kinds of problems that they might be facing. So that's great. Again, if you can find a partner in there that you want to reach out to and message privately to chat more with, I think that'd be a great use.
I have a comment about linked open data that I can share if we have a sec.
Yeah, please.
So I was just going to say that I know that it's when you like use a spreadsheet to collect your data, it can be confusing about how do you engage in linked open data. And we actually published a paper several years ago about how to do this with zooarchaeology. Oh, and there's another question. Real quick, if you explore some of the places that Leigh had on the previous slide, like Period O and these kinds of places, go to those websites and check out what they have there. And what it does is you can find things like, for example, with Period O, you can find a period that you might use in your research, like Middle Bronze Age or whatever, and you can find a canonical or sort of official definition of that period that works for your research, and you can grab the link to that from that site and paste it into your spreadsheet in a period column that you create. And that way, that is like citing that official description of that period without having to describe it in your own publication or your own research. And so it actually cuts down on the labor that you have to do to describe your official terms that you're using. And it links up with other projects that have linked to that particular period. So just that as an example, I just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, don't recreate the wheel, whatever you do. And what Sarah just outlined allows you to really build rather than start from scratch. Cornelia, I see your hand up. I didn't realize we could raise hands in here. This is great.
Yes. Okay, I will also share my camera if I can.
Sure.
It doesn't work.
No problem.
First of all, I wanted to share the idea of setting up interviews when you talk with other people, because I'm a PhD student, and of course, at this stage, there is still a lot of insecurity when you talk to specialists and everything. So, and you don't know where to start to share data with each other. So, setting up like questions, like an interviewer, I think this is a great input and idea. So, thank you for that. I have a question, maybe because sometimes you start out with the project and you have data in mind. At the beginning, you don't have it physically, you don't have it, right in front of you. And when you also have like the research question, which is always recursive, and you have to check if this is still valid and so on. What are the I don't know, possible approaches to deal with data that you for some reasons can't access, and how to deal with the situation when you're like in a later stage of your PhD already?
Yeah, my thought to that is, one, it's an issue of being flexible, right? If you are sort of thinking through an organizational scheme before you actually get to the data, you might have to change that organizational scheme when you see what you're working with. So that idea of flexibility from the start, I think, is important. But the second thought that I had relates to what we were just talking about with using published data sets to think about what's important. Right.
Yeah.
So archaeological data, it varies widely from site to site and from subdiscipline to subdiscipline, but there are certain things that are going to be consistent. And you can use published data sets to think through that consistency so that when you do get access to that data that you need for your research, you're not starting from scratch and you're not thrown totally for a loop. It's not a perfect system, right? Ideally, you would have the data first and you could tool through it and see what you need, but it's kind of making the best out of a not perfect situation.
Yeah, that's true. I think for master and PhD students, it's rarely the case that you have a fixed and ready to use data. And I think this is a good thought. Thank you.
Yeah, great question too. We're going to give some more time for questions. So if you're stewing on something, feel free to put it in the chat, and Tiffany and Sarah might be able to flag it. Or as Cornelia just taught us, you can possibly raise your hand if you want to unmute and ask a question in a little bit. But we're going to turn to curating data, because when we think about being data literate and what we think about working with data, we also want to think about data quality and data structure and data management as seriously as we think about our research questions. And that's exactly what we're going to focus on for the next little bit. How can we create data sets that are ready to be analyzed by us and ready to be reused by others is really the theme here. So with data quality, how do we even begin? How do we even begin to define what data quality is? And this goes back a little bit to your question, Cornelia, right? When we're working in the absence of a definition of data quality and standards, how do we begin to recognize good quality data when we find it? And how can we try to structure our own work so that we can produce it? So data quality is something that is oddly hard to define. If you look at the literature around data quality, definitions can vary widely, but most will revolve around an idea of suitability for application, which is pretty vague, but suitability for some kind of use. So in other words, how reliably and how efficiently does a data set support some kind of predefined analytical goal? And in other words, how easily will that data set help you address the questions you're hoping to answer? While it's hard enough to try to define data quality when you're collecting for your own project, it gets even harder when you start thinking long term, thinking about the data that could be reused at some point in the future by future you or by other people that you haven't met for applications that you haven't even imagined. So although there's so much we can control and anticipate when we're thinking about these futures and these potential applications, there are a few dimensions of data quality that we can control when we're creating our own data sets. So the first of these is documentation. How well do you understand what's included in a data set? How well illustrated is the background of the creation of that data set, like the sampling protocols and the standards? What is and what's not included in the data set? All of that would be sort of included under this idea of documentation. Another quality is specificity. So a lot of times the data may be presented to you aggregated at a level that's not very specific. At the abstract, we get aggregated versions of data when we read scholarship, right? You're used to reading articles, you're used to reading chapters, you're used to reading books that summarize an argument that is based at some level on the analysis of data. So in your own process of finding data, if you're collecting data from published resources, how granular are those data? Are you looking at a table that contains a summary that supports an author's specific argument? Or does that table give you enough detail so that you can use it to explore other questions? Most projects are going to require a really high level of specificity. Finally, completeness. So is the coverage of the data adequate to explore the kinds of questions you want to address? What are the gaps? What's missing? How much is available that may be offering you enough, say, statistical power to explore a question you want to ask? Or if there's some important contextual information that helps with your argument, is that available to you? So while data quality may ultimately be difficult to define, understanding these three dimensions, and these aren't all the dimensions of data quality, but just a few that I want to highlight today. Understanding these dimensions of data quality can help you identify good data when you see it, and in turn can help you create data sets that others recognize as good. Moreover, the ways that data creation practices unfold in research projects really touch upon these different aspects of data quality. And this allows us to turn our attention to this idea of data structure. We can discuss data structure in the context of three main types of research practices. And while we're going to talk about research teams here, remember that in your own personal research program, you are your teammate, right? It's you and future you working towards this goal. So in siloed work practices, you find individual researchers who are working largely in isolation. They're siloed, and their work is not systematically connected to that of any of their colleagues. So in the context of your personal research, this might mean that you're only thinking about the one-off project and not the big picture program. Individually or at the team level, this can really lend itself to some different kinds of issues and problems over time. In team practices, you are concerned with the bigger picture. Individual members of a team may be responsible for some subset of data, but they're also concerned with making sure that that subset fits into the larger whole and can be used by the entire team. So in the context of your personal research program here, you've got an eye towards that big research picture program. You've got an eye towards you being able to reuse and reanalyze data that you've produced. Finally, thinking about global practices encourages you to acknowledge the data you're creating can and often should link out to data that's part of a whole wide data universe. And this goes back to Sarah's comment from before about finding ways to link to these published standards. Here, we can think back to those linked open data resources like Periodo and Nomisma that we highlighted on the slide before. One of the key aspects in all of this is identifiers, which can cause real problems over time if they're not carefully considered from the start. And we touched on this a little bit in our workshop last month, but it's an idea that's going to keep coming up in terms of just making sure that you are organized and ready to produce good quality data. So let's look at an example to see why these can be problematic. Here are some examples of notes from an excavation in which different members of the team were working in their own individual silos. The excavator gave a find number in the field to an object that's labeled at A, and then the conservation team gave it a conservation number at B. And the faunal analyst then later gave it a bone number, C. As the last step in the workflow, the bone number never made it back to the field notebook or to the conservation notes. And these sorts of workflow issues may seem trivial, but in practice, they can make it really challenging to later synchronize all of this related work. And since most of us are archaeologists on this call, or people that are coming from cultural heritage backgrounds, I bet we've all seen this and we've all been incredibly frustrated when we've seen it in practice. We can also think about this more schematically. So in the middle here, we've got a very simple data table that describes archaeological contexts. At the bottom, we've got data provided by the project's coin specialist. And then at the top, we've got data provided by the project zooarchaeologist. Each of these tables describes the attributes that are relevant for those individual specialists for their own area of expertise. But they're using really different conventions when writing things that could be standardized. For instance, are context, locus, and find spot all actually referring to the same thing? Are Roman numerals used here the same way that Arabic numbers are? These sorts of inconsistencies are going to make it difficult to link between these and other related data sets. And this is a really common problem that, again, I'm sure many of us are quite familiar with. And I also just want to point out that when we look at these, and especially if we're familiar with the site, we might be able to understand that locus and context and find spot all refer to the same thing. But this is problematic, one, for computers. So if you're hoping to do any sort of rigorous digital analysis, computers are not going to be able to tell that those columns represent the same thing. And it's also very problematic for people that are not familiar with the project, right? Who may come from projects where they do have different standards and they do have different definitions. So trying to make sure that everything is standardized is really important for communicating your research properly. However, thinking about the big picture helps avoid the breakdowns and enables integration of data that are created by different members of the team. This is really the heart of the notion of team collaborative practices, whether you're working with an actual team or, again, you're working with yourself. So standardization of vocabulary and the shift helps you begin to recognize how a set of disjointed tables can become, in the future, a relational database, because you can link those things by common fields, which in this case are represented by the locus field. And the same principles fit when you start to think about how you can apply global standards to the data that you're creating. Since that's the ultimate goal, I don't want to talk too much about this. So let's actually go ahead and take a step back to think about what you can begin to do now to structure your data to get to the point where you can link it sort of more rigorously. The first thing that you want to think about is coming up with some way to standardize the collection of data in forms, right? There's a real value in maintaining project notebooks and narrative records of what's happening. If you're anything like me, you've also found this much more valuable as the years go by and your memory gets less and less sharp. You know, having a narrative of what I accomplished every day in the field, and even really in my own life, my home life, is really important to me. But having a way in the field to standardize the recording of data allows you to make choices ahead of time so that in the moment, people working on your team or you are not having to jot down notes that aren't standard and aren't specific enough. So coming up with some kind of standardized data collection forms. Relatedly, taking those forms and potentially digitizing those forms in the form of a spreadsheet can be really, really valuable. And when you get to the non-analog versions of data collection, you can really begin to start to think about standardized vocabulary. So in a spreadsheet, for instance, thinking about using drop downs, thinking about using data validation formulas that are not difficult to set up, even in something like OpenOffice, or here's an example from Google Sheets, but just in order to standardize the information that you're collecting and make sure that it's all regular. Additionally, tools like OpenRefine can help you clean data sets that might already be full of inconsistencies. So OpenRefine, a free and open source program that allows you to manipulate data so that you're not going through and correcting every misspelling of the word natural or every misspelling of the word blank. You can do that kind of en masse with OpenRefine so that your data is clean and consistent. Another thing that you can do at this point in your process is document everything, document your process. So I have an example here of just a README tab on a spreadsheet that I created that provides a short definition for the fields that I have created. And those fields, it should be noted, they correspond to a physical form that was recorded at a site, the site of Gabby. So thinking about creating some sort of definition schema, not only for yourself, but again, for other people that might want to use your data in the future. That way you're not, I know we're pushing informational interviews, and those are great for this sort of work, but you don't want to be having conversations with everyone who uses your data about what you meant when you said year, about what you meant when you said area, right? So having that documented so that can be an asynchronous conversation is a much better step in the process. Additionally, and this, goes back to a lot of what we've been saying over the past 2 workshops, but thinking critically about your identifiers, right? Making sure that your data don't look like those examples on the left-hand side of the screen where they are standalone spreadsheets, but setting them up so that they can be linked, setting them up so that they do participate in this broader network of data collection and data analysis is very important. And that gets us thinking about going from something like a single one-off spreadsheet to a spreadsheet that is intended to be linked to something like a relational database. And here I show you just the back end of a relational database where you can see that on the surface, this looks very complicated, but ultimately it was built by a series of spreadsheets that were able to be linked, like you see here on the right. So a complicated interface like this actually rests on the strong foundations of practices that you can build into your work from a very early stage. Even if you're not ready to build a big relational database for myriad reasons. And again, we discussed a lot of these during the last session. Part of it is a question of scale, right? How big is your project? How much time do you have and how much funding do you have to complete this project? If you are working with a rather simple data set, you do not need to build something this complicated. You do not need to build something this complicated. And it might be more distracting than it is helpful. Depending on the scale of your project. So ultimately, we want to stress that simple is better, especially if simple can be set up so that you could eventually move to something like this, right? So from the beginning, thinking about identifiers, thinking about the fields you need in order to link before you actually get to this stage. So with that in mind, I want to pose one more poll for you all. Thinking about the questions that you're asking, thinking about your research program, can your research data be managed with spreadsheets, or does it have to be managed with a relational database? And there's one dummy answer on there, because hopefully by now, no one's going to pick isolated spreadsheets, because we know that there are really easy ways to make sure we set ourselves up for success in the future. All right. Again, we've kind of hit critical mass. So about half and half with spreadsheets and relational data. We have a small sample size and a few people that still want to figure out what's best for them. What's the best way to do that? Informational interviews, right? Talk to your colleagues, talk to us. You know, we're happy to kind of engage in these conversations with you, but you hopefully feel like you have a lot of resources out there to ultimately make those decisions about what's going to be best for your research program. To summarize this discussion of curating data, remember that data quality matters, data structure matters. These are really easy takeaways. And then ultimately, in terms of data management, simple is better, as long as you are sure to set yourself and your data up for success in the future. So with that, let me pause again just to ask for any questions. And again, if you've typed them in the chat, I don't know, Tiffany and Sarah, if you saw them, but I can scroll up as well. Or if anyone has a question and they want to raise their hand, we can, since we're a small group, we can call on you. Okay, again, if questions come up, feel free to post them in the chat and we can have a discussion at the end, or we can address them later. But let's move on then to our discussion of analyzing data. Our goal for the next little bit of time is really allowing us to think about what kinds of tools we might need to master in order to be able to answer our research questions. So remember, if we start out with a broad and multi-scalar research program, we've got questions that are data-driven. However we're approaching them, if we're data first or we're questions first, they're still data-driven. So what can we do now, and what sort of tools might we need to master in order to do these things? So I'm going to talk very briefly about statistical analyses, and then Tiffany's going to take over to talk about geospatial and network analyses. But this is another opportunity for us to really stress the importance of informational interviews. We keep doing this today. I think it's really just that Tiffany and I are starved for coffee dates, and even if they're over Zoom, you can reach out to us to chat. But if you know people that are working with some kind of tool or some sort of method that you want to learn more about, why not pick their brains about it? Again, people are so keen to talk about their work and their research. So this is a really good step in the process towards figuring out if this is right for you. Regarding statistical analysis, these can go from kind of very basic applications, probably that most of us learned in math classes. And if you're like me, promptly forgot until we realized that actually these are pretty important. But the very basic could involve things like mean or average, median or middle value, and mode, which is the most frequently represented value. Maybe those are terms that sound familiar if you have taken a math class, if you sort of engage in very basic statistical analyses. It's important to think about how data can be grouped when we want to embark on statistical analyses, because there are really 3 different types of data. And the type of data you have is going to dictate the kind of analysis you can do. So nominal data, we also call categorical. Nominal data contains no numerical value, no ranking. So think about maybe a multiple choice or a drop down in a spreadsheet, something that contains these categorical data, like we saw before. Are they anthropic, or are they natural contexts that we're looking at? Ordinal data contains order, but has no numerical values. So you can think of these as fields that are construed on a scale from best to worst, from tallest to shortest. Ordinal data isn't something that we deal with too frequently in archaeology, but you might be able to think of some examples there. Numerical data contains numbers. It should come as no surprise. And the values that we have when we think about numerical data, they contain an order, and there is a specific distance between the values. So the types of data that you have and that you're considering dictate the kinds of analyses you want to do. And I won't get too far into that right here. But something else that's handy to think about is the difference between a symmetrical or an asymmetrical distribution in terms of a statistical analysis. And this is where your mean and your median and your mode come in handy. Symmetrical, we often call the normal distribution. Asymmetrical, we often call the skewed distribution. And if you Google these, I didn't put an image in the slide, but if you Google them, you can see kind of what a normal versus a skewed would look like. The normal distribution is important when you're working through univariable analysis or single variable analysis. Multivariate analysis, in contrast, can tell you if changes in variables are related. So again, this would dictate the kinds of questions that you have and the kinds of data that you've collected. Ultimately, sample size really matters. And the sample size you have is going to give your statistical analysis strength. It's going to give it the backing that will substantiate your claims. And when we're dealing with archaeological data, we are very rarely dealing with large data sets. We talked a little bit about this last time, and how, you know, we hear the term big data thrown out all the time, and that rarely applies to us, even if we're using thousands of finds and thousands of survey points. That's still not big in the grand scheme of things. So sample size matters, and outliers matter, and how you deal with those matter. And this is kind of just a basic overview, but I really want to encourage you to make sure you check out the link that I've included on this slide. There's a very short podcast by the Archaeological Podcast Network that goes over in sort of very basic detail what you might want to think about in terms of archaeological statistical analysis, that I found really helpful in trying to organize my thoughts. But with a little bit of that background and some of those definitions, what are some tools you might want to familiarize yourself with to get started? Well, first and foremost, the very basic statistics could be done in a program like OpenOffice, could be done in a program like Google Sheets. I throw OpenOffice up here, in part because it's free, it's easy to manipulate, and actually quite powerful if you do want to go a little bit farther beyond just the mean, the mode, and the median. There are some additional applications that you can engage in, but the sort of starting point for learning how to do basic statistics in a spreadsheet program is very easy. Ultimately, you might want to think about learning some sort of programming language that can also allow you a great deal of freedom and power in terms of your statistical analysis. One platform that is great for this is RStudio, which is a platform for coding in R. RStudio is probably more useful for more complex statistics. So again, on the scale from simple to complex, don't make things harder for yourself than they have to be. If you're already comfortable with something like OpenOffice, if you're already comfortable with spreadsheets, stick with that. If you want to try something new, if you already know R, if you already know some coding, then RStudio or some other interface and graphical user interface for R might be useful for you to play around with. But both platforms are going to allow you to produce very kind of minimal graphical representations of your data as well. So when we talk about statistics, we're always talking about graphs, and both of them will allow you to do that. One platform that you might be less familiar with is a platform called Tableau. And I highlight it here because although it is not open source, it is free to educators. They make you jump through a few hoops to try to get the educator's license, but it is worth it, especially if you are interested in producing more complicated visualizations. So Tableau could be a useful way to help you reason through those. One of the difficult things about Tableau is that it is difficult to kind of export data from Tableau. So again, on the scale from simple to complicated, I group that with the more complicated just because it is very proprietary in the work that it does. But using any of these programs to kind of get a basic start and to explore what you might want to think about in terms of statistical analysis is a really good place to get started. But with that, I'm going to pass it off to Tiffany.
All right, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about geospatial analysis. And geospatial analysis tools have been revolutionizing archaeology in recent years. Platforms that involve GIS or geographical information systems are on a very basic level, but a variation on databases, except for in this case, they have a geographical analysis angle to them. However, there are some things that you need to consider when you are thinking about doing some spatial analysis with whatever your things are. So whatever it is that you're studying, you will need some geographical coordinates of the materials analyzed. And just to give you a very sort of practical example, I'll speak very briefly about my own doctoral dissertation research. So when I started my research project, I had a topic, and my topic was the ancient empire of Urartu, which was the big enemy of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. They existed to their north, and I wanted to study them as a large-scale, multi-regional, and historically, temporally variable phenomenon. That's the idea that I had. And so then I went out and I looked, okay, what data are available that could help me get at my topic? And how this played out for me is I found this great, vast data set of German archaeological survey that unfortunately we didn't have geographical coordinates for. So a lot of the work that I put into this project was using freely available high-resolution satellite data to use the old field notes, sketch maps, etc., to locate these fortresses using a geographical coordinate system. However, doing all of this certainly requires knowledge of appropriate geographical coordinate systems as well as projection systems. This is another point at which I am going to encourage you to get high quality information early on when you're designing your project and talk to experts, geospatial experts who are already working in your region to understand what the most appropriate way to structure your data might be. Another thing that I'll say is even though GIS platforms are incredibly powerful and have been incredibly helpful in my own research, I will say that they require a steep learning curve. So a question that you'll want to ask yourself early on is, should I acquire these skills or collaborate? So once I had assembled this data set of Urartian fortress sites, I then asked myself a series of research questions that could be answered with the data that I had on hand. And I'll get to this in a moment, but one of the questions that I asked was, could these fortress sites see one another? I, inspired like many historians of this period, had read the Neo-Assyrian text Sargon's Eighth Campaign. And in this particular text, there is this vivid scene in which the Urartians light their fire beacons. So I wanted to even know if this was even conceptually possible. So I thought maybe this is something that I could test geospatially. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's take a quick look at some of the large and popular tools that are available for geospatial analysis. The most, let's call it the market leader, the most popular tool that is used for GIS is undoubtedly Esri's ArcGIS. It is a large, powerful, popular platform, which means that it's well supported. The reason why it is well supported is because it is a proprietary software. But one of the advantages of it being a proprietary software platform is that anyone who has been working in the digital humanities space for any amount of time knows that, tools, come online and die literally every day. And so one great thing about ArcGIS is you can be sure that they're in it for the long haul. However, on the con side of this tool, it's incredibly expensive. An individual license for the GIS Desktop Pro for an annual subscription, not the software, but just for a subscription, will set you back something on the order of $4,000 a year if you don't have an educational affiliation. So if you're thinking long-term, you're thinking about the long-term prospects of your research, it is something to think about. One con on the research side is that ArcGIS is proprietary, which also means that they won't always define the code or the mathematical operators that are being used to define certain kinds of analyses. What this meant for me when I was doing my own dissertation research is that I actually took some of my operations outside of ArcGIS and took it into a different computational platform called MATLAB because I could understand what the code actually said, what the code actually did. This may or may not be important to people who are working in commercial or military settings, but as a researcher, it was incredibly important to me. And another thing that I will tell you with some personal assurance is that old versions of ArcGIS don't always play nicely with the new ones. And any of us who use ArcGIS live in terror of having to update to a new version. Next slide, please. So here is the open source equivalent to QGIS. And the big advantages of it are that it's free, it's open, it supports a wide, truly stunning array of different data types versus ArcGIS. Sometimes people will ask me, should I use ArcGIS? Should I use QGIS? I used to kind of present it in pros and cons, but these days I'm actually presenting it a little bit differently. When they ask me if they should use this one or that one, I say yes. In other words, what I'm saying is go ahead and use them both. Go ahead and familiarize yourself with QGIS. The first time I opened up QGIS, I was really delightfully surprised with, as a longtime user of ArcGIS, I found it very intuitive and easy to try. And one thing that I actually assign in graduate seminars that I teach is I have regular ArcGIS users who are students go ahead and try QGIS. And my experience has been that people who are familiar with the first platform can generally figure out the graphic user interface of the free source version. So it's a little bit like going from, Microsoft Word to OpenOffice. There are some differences, but it's similar enough that experienced users can figure it out. So there are different kinds of analyses that ArcGIS might do that QGIS doesn't, and vice versa. So if you are willing to experiment with them both, you're going to have many more tools at your fingertips. My favorite thing in QGIS versus ArcGIS are some of its enhanced, I think, cartographic features. I find labeling in QGIS much less of a headache than it is in ArcGIS. However, there are some, I guess, some sort of things to think about with QGIS. The longevity may be less certain, although it does seem like QGIS is kind of an ascendant software package. I don't think we've heard the end of it yet. And its support mostly depends on the goodwill of an albeit dedicated community of users, because you're not paying these exorbitant software fees. So on the other hand, you don't have the software development support available. Next slide, please. And now on to GRASS. Sometimes people will think of GRASS as being another kind of free ArcGIS. Well, one thing I will say is that it is and it isn't. I would say that GRASS is more of an equivalent of a lot of the things that are in the ArcGIS toolbox. So a lot of those, like spatial analyst tools, for example, that you use, they can be found as a free source option in GRASS. So this tool it's free, it's open, it has a variety of powerful analysis tools. My students recently pointed out to me that there is a video from 1987 that talks about GRASS. You can see it online, and it's narrated by William Shatner. We thought that was very interesting and entertaining. However, I will say, and even as a geospatial person who does a certain amount of my own coding, that GRASS is not for the faint of heart. It involves a lot of coding, and you need to understand at least how the logic of that works. It doesn't have much in the way of a graphic user interface, but one good piece of news is that QGIS is now sort of acting as the front person for GRASS, and these two softwares are now playing nicely with one another. So QGIS can be a better way to interact with GRASS when you need an analysis that's available in GRASS. However, again, it's a free software. So, who knows what the long-term prospects are. Next slide, please. Okay, so the thing that I started talking about, when I started talking about spatial analysis, is whether or not these fortresses could see one another. And a tool that I found incredibly helpful in understanding this were network analysis tools. And network analysis tools are becoming more and more popular in archaeology, although at times one feels like we're still in the beginning stages of understanding what network analysis can do for archaeology, because a lot of these uses of network analysis focus upon data visualization. However, when combined with a field of math called graph theory, there are certain kinds of ways that you can numerically analyze these networks that you define in an archaeological context, which can make this kind of research a bit more powerful.
So hopefully the slew that Tiffany and I just introduced you to has sparked some ideas and has made you think about your own work. We have 2 more polls and then we're going to close up. I know we're just at the end of our time. But the first question, what kind of analysis do you already focus on in your own research? Do you do some kind of statistical, geospatial network? Do you do some combination of these? And again, if it's some combination, go ahead and post on that in the chat, because we'd be interested to hear. And even, if you're talking about statistical or geospatial or network, what level do you do? What sorts of questions are you asking? If you're statistics, are you looking at very simple statistical distributions? Are you doing something like multivariate complex analysis? Go ahead and end the poll. So a lot of combination of all of those. So hopefully you guys will have a lot to say in the chat if you care to. But yeah, and the next question then sort of follows up on this one and hopes that you've been inspired by the last 15-20 minutes or so. What kinds of analysis are you most interested in learning to apply to your own research? Statistical, geospatial, network, some combination, or what else do you need? And I think what we're finding with both this question and the previous question is that a lot of people are thinking of combining a variety of different methods. Go ahead and end that and share it. So yeah, hopefully you can all see those results. So yeah, a huge sort of spread on that spectrum of what people are interested in. And questions like this, I think, can help us when we think about what kinds of workshops we want to prepare for you in the future, and how we might best serve the members of the ASOR community, and especially the members of the Early Career Scholars group. So in terms of these different types of analysis, and again, these are representative, there are a lot of other things we could have talked about, but I want to open up the floor for questions one more time before we close. I know we're running a little late.
I'm willing to stay and answer any questions that anyone has. Don't feel like it's an imposition to ask questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't see anyone jumping. So let me, again, second what Tiffany, oh, we do have a hand up. So excited. Jeffrey, yeah.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
So Tiffany, so I think I've met you in a coffee hour and I was complaining about how ArcGIS never likes to behave. In terms of the kind of, because I've always used ArcMap because luckily I've always had access to it. I've used QGIS a little bit or tried to, and it's always those minor differences that get me. But in terms of the, like the tools that might be missing, is it possible just to try and program them yourself? I don't know if QGIS is Python based like ArcMap is.
Yes, so Python and C, I mean, it really is a flexible programming environment. So yes, you could. However, I think most of the things that you will want to do for archaeology already exist because they are so common. And one thing that I find really helpful is that there are actually a lot of really helpful tutorials out there. Or sometimes even if you'll ask some of your colleagues, recently I wanted to start performing least cost path analyses. And I reached out to a couple of my colleagues who are geospatial experts. And one of my colleagues said, actually, I have a lab that I routinely do with my graduate seminars. I can send it to you. And so I was able to teach myself how to perform the most advanced kind of least cost path analysis in an hour. So this is another case where reaching out to people who have already developed, pedagogical tools can help you as a researcher as well.
I feel like one of the
Thank you.
I feel like one of the most frustrating things for me about geospatial analysis is that when I see it taught, it's so often taught as a platform specific practice, and it has to be, right? Because you're so invested in kind of learning ARC, you're so invested in learning QGIS that it's difficult to take a step back. But that kind of goes back to the conversation we had last month about how data literacy is just getting comfortable around trying and getting comfortable around, being able to attempt to learn a new skill or think about new data practices, so that even if, QGIS, like I find that incredibly clunky as well, but even if QGIS is incredibly clunky, I can still sort of tool around, and I'm not the kind of person who will shut down and not pursue the questions that I'm asking just because an interface is a little clunky. And I think that's kind of what we're all aiming for. So your question, Jeffrey, as well about, can I go in and program it myself? Like that's exactly the kinds of questions that we want to be asking if we're moving towards data literacy. I love that.
Right. I mean, another tool that I didn't speak about that I used quite a bit for my dissertation was MATLAB Mapping Toolbox. MATLAB is a programming language and a programming environment with a lot of libraries that is widely used in STEM fields and in engineering. And most of the things that archaeologists want to do already exist in existing libraries. And I found this a much more flexible as well as open and transparent environment for particularly some of my iterative things that I wanted to run. It was much less buggy than ArcGIS. I found that even when you try to use Model Builder, for either parallel or iterative computing, that if you had a 10-hour model, it would invariably get hung up at hour 5 for some reason. So you're asking good questions, and that is, do other coding environments, or is there a certain amount of flexibility in this work? And the answer is yes. And yeah, those are great questions that you're asking, Jeffrey.
All right. So takeaways and next steps. We've luckily talked about a lot of these throughout the course of our conversation today. So I'm not going to dwell on this now, except to say that we have one more workshop coming up in this series that is telling stories with archaeological data, set for just before the ASOR annual meetings. So I hope you all will attend virtually and then hopefully meet some members of our team in person in Chicago. But definitely sign up for that. You've got the link there on the flyer, and I'll also be following up with an email after the workshop. But if you wouldn't mind, please take our reflection survey. So I've got the link there, and I'll follow up again after the workshop with this. But the reflection survey really is going to allow us to think about how we can cater our content for what you all want and what you're working on. Something that I'm already kind of stewing about is coming up with some sort of short video tutorials about different platforms and how they're applicable for different kinds of projects, and not necessarily giving you the whole user's guide, but giving you a short taste of some things you might want to think about. So and that just came out of our conversation from today, so who knows what'll come out of the feedback that you guys sent. So if you wouldn't mind filling that out, that would be great. And thank you again. Tiffany said we'll stay around if you have any questions, so feel free to unmute yourself at this time. Thanks again.